Good morning. Hello, everyone. It is, are we recording, Chris? Okay, it is 8:10 on June 13th, 2023. My name is Paul Bohm, and I'm the chair of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Task Force. I'm calling this meeting to order. The agenda for this meeting is posted on the task force's webpage in compliance with the Massachusetts Open Meeting Law. This hybrid meeting is being recorded on Zoom and will be accessible on the town's YouTube site. Copies of all materials to be discussed today were previously posted on the task force's webpage, and any additional material that is discussed today will be posted after this meeting and will be available on the webpage. We need somebody to take minutes today. Frank, are you, sorry, Rich? Will you be taking minutes remotely, or should we have somebody in the room do that?
I think I can take them remotely. I may have to go back to the video to see who said what, but yeah, I'm willing to do it.
Okay, that's fine. So I'll confirm that Rich Feely will take meeting notes for today's meeting. So at this point, I'm going to ask the task force members to indicate their presence when I call their names. Carrie Flood.
Here.
Claire Booth. Here. Kurt Herman. I see Kurt on Zoom. You're on mute, Kurt. There.
Morning, Paul. Here via Zoom.
Okay, thanks. Gary Kleiman is not here. Pam Hill. Here. Rich Feely.
Here.
Carl Seidman. Here. David Ropeek. Here. And Paul Bohm. I am here. I'd like to also welcome those on the Zoom. Terry Ackerman, our select board representative. Chris Harmony, who's in the room. Pam Rockwell from the 2229 Main Street Oversight Committee, our liaison. She is here. And others on the Zoom today. Thanks for being here. Let me start out by just reviewing the agenda, because I have a few things to say about the agenda, if I can find that. Okay, hopefully you can see this. So today is largely, I'll call this a discussion about legal issues and things related to legal issues. But I want to start off by going back to our previous meeting, where at the end we sort of had volunteers and assignments for different work streams. I just want to confirm that and go over that. But also I want to discuss how I've been putting these agenda topics together and how I'm thinking of proceeding forward pending your comments. So we're in the, I guess, the startup mode, and we are getting conversations going with our resources, our liaison folks. Skio talked to us at the last meeting, as did EPA. Today, Mina Markarius, Town Council, I want to welcome you. He's here to lead this discussion. Our next meeting, Rue Associates, is the outside consultant to the town on risk safety issues. They're going to be at that next meeting. And then last but not least, the day after, on the 28th, we're going to be having a site meeting, and we'll be talking with DeMaximus, the cleanup contractors, who are also an important liaison. So I just mentioned that because through the end of June, we're sort of getting into startup mode and just getting understanding of the resources. So each of the groups can kind of plan forward who they have to talk to, what the ideas for moving forward. After that, I'd like to go into a mode of each meeting to meet into deep dives on each of the work streams. I know Carl and Carrie have prepared a sort of initial work plan on the operational / economic issues. And thanks for sending that to me. So we'll defer that discussion a little bit, and I'll circulate that work plan before the meeting. But after this initial startup phase through the end of June, I'd like to get into the mode of spending each meeting discussing one or several of the work streams. And I'm going to need your input to that, because and I'll ask for sort of input on the agenda. You know, we have a meeting in July. Are there any specific topics in your work stream you want to discuss? If not, I'll just kind of cycle each meeting through the work streams. And so we will build on the opportunity to interact with each other and give feedback as you kind of try to understand how we're going to execute those work streams. So that, just want to mention, that's how I'm thinking about these agendas. Does that make sense to everybody? Court.
Certainly makes sense to me. I'm curious, not a leading question here. Are you thinking of having the subgroups then submit something 72 hours prior, you know, a one page, so people have a sense of what's coming? Or is that unnecessary? What do you think?
Not a leading question, somewhat leading. Not leading. I think that would be very beneficial if we're talking about a work stream to have some information to discuss. So yes, I think what Carl has done is that he's outlined a sort of a work plan. Almost looks like an outline for the input to the report. I like that thinking because we are going to have to prepare a report. But I think these work streams are going to evolve. So each group is going to be slightly at different stages. So yes, some input. But as you notice, there's going to be a lot of overlaps between these work streams. I know that Carl has identified some legal issues sort of that I know he's going to tease some of those up today, but within that work stream. So I think I want to identify those overlaps so that if there's redundancy, we know there's redundancy, and it's good. And it's good that we have that for certain issues.
One of the areas that I've been thinking about is communications and the step-by-step path that you've laid out and the more siloed path that you've laid out does not include the question that we need to consider as to when to do, here's what we're up to kind of communication with the town, not about the specific risk behavior. Our task force exists and all of that. It is, in my opinion, premature at this point, but it's a kind of a group thing as opposed to a one task force off thing. So at some point, I encourage you to give that some air for discussion.
Definitely, and this is something that you're all going to participate in. The select board would like us to engage the town and have an open meeting. We discussed at our last meeting. That's premature to have it like now. But I think, just my sense, we'll be ready in the fall sometime for that briefing, whatever that is. I think we have to go through the summer, have discussions, and get our acts together in each of these areas, so we can give an update to the public and get their input on all these various work streams. I know the reuse issues, I think there'll be additional public input, but there'll be input on others. There'll be concerns that others raise on safety and et cetera.
I would I would encourage us to think beyond just that public meeting as to communications. It's a relationship sort of thing, not just the words you use and who speaks at the meeting and those sorts of questions. And that may be something that we want to start on in other ways sooner, or other than just the public meeting. We might want to do, for example, outreach to people we know who have particular concerns, overlap with, meeting with Pam's committee. These are relationship things so that we can understand what people's questions and concerns are and take them into account, show that they've been taken into account, which is going to inure a lot to the relationship between us and the town, which is what I see as broadly communication. So I would just encourage you to think of it as more than just that full read.
Yeah, no, I agree. When you say me, it's us.
Yeah.
Two reactions to that. One is the public's invited to these meetings, and so they can kind of see the sausage making as we're going through this, and there's input through that vehicle. Offline of these meetings, there'll be discussions one-on-one, two-on with other people. For example, I've encouraged Gary Clement to interact with other town committees. So that's and the public through those committees, because they have interest in the site as well. So I think there'll be lots of ways of communicating, and I think at some point we probably have to map those out.
Yeah,
Map those out. Make sure we're not missing anything. I agree. Sorry, Carl.
Yeah, just I think one other once we have sort of the individual groups work streams, I think we're gonna have to think through the sort of phasing of those workforce components. As I know when Carrie and I and Pam met yesterday, there was sort of, well, we need to know what the reuse plan is to fully develop our work. So I think, you know, at some point, we're gonna have to think about the phasing of work, or whether every team is gonna do like a first iteration, and then we're gonna compare notes, and then go back and do a second iteration, since there's so much interdependence.
Yeah,
You know, thinking about how we're gonna manage
And we
that in the work stream, I think is an issue we're gonna have to come back to.
We might be able to do a ballpark, or what are the issues that come up if it's this scenario, and what else if it's this scenario. But we won't be able to get anything near precise until we know what really is the recommendation.
I expect that we're gonna get clarity as we kind of move forward and talk with each other. You know, the two metaphors that I think are appropriate for this committee, you've used silos, but it's also a blender. So combination of silos and blenders, that should be on our cover of our report. Silos plus blenders equals plus the town.
Here's the 229 advisory committee smoothie.
Oh, I can just see the graphic.
Well, it is a smoothie. Yeah, it is. Anyway, so that's on the agendas, plan moving forward. And the last thing I want to do before I turn this over is just show this graphic one more time. This guy here. So this is what we agreed, I think we agreed to as we were kind of breaking up at the last meeting. Just want to, I think you all know this, but want to confirm that. So we have these four interdependent and interactive work streams. And so Pam Hill and Court, their major here is the acquisition and legal path. Their minor is everything else. Gary and Rich Feely on the reuse concept. Kurt and David, Kurt Herman and David Ropeek on safety and site uses. And as we talked about, Carl and Carrie on the operational and economic issues. And this is the last time you'll see this thing, because I think the content is going to change as you develop these ideas and you know, exactly what needs to get done. Okay. Any further thoughts or comments on this? Go ahead.
Carl, I think you hit it just right, where each one is going to move forward. And then hear the others, and then course correct, and then we're gonna take another step forward, watching the other three results.
Yeah,
Well, it's gonna evolve just that way, hopefully.
it's an evolution. You never know what the group mutations are going to result in, you know, the evolution of our work. Now,
I think it's actually, but I mean, just, we're going to start showing our drafted thinking in a chart form like this at some point where we can look at, I'm not saying we should, but I wonder if we will start doing that when something, for example, what Carrie and Carl did, you know, when that gets into a form that is at least usable, we have discussion, and we're going to be tossing that into this.
yeah, I think you should, and I don't want to. They have a beautiful chart that they put together, and I don't want to, you know, Carl put together, and which has various tasks, 3.0, 3.1, so a number of tasks which have to be investigated. And I think that's going to be true certainly for the legal
Yeah.
path as well.
We can sort of create the sort of the recipe for these smoothie by putting these things into our.
Yeah, one of the recipes on the legal work stream, and Chris Carmody and I put this together, and we didn't quite clear it with Mina totally, but I throw it out here. So there are these issues at a minimum that have to be covered in the legal work stream, you know, title research, resolution of liens, pathway for acquisitions, exactly how to do it, how do we limit liability as a site purchaser, the post-acquisition liability limitation, and then maximizing legal rights to reuse. These may not be the final pieces of the outline. You may want to rephrase this, but this is what you're talking about. These are the various elements and the details in there. And I'm sure Mina has slightly different ideas on all this, but so perfect segue to Mina Markarius, Town Council. You can introduce yourself and tell everybody how you've gotten into this particular activity.
Fell into the blender, I guess, yeah.
How you fell into the blender.
Yeah, no, so good morning, everyone. I'm Mina Macarius from Anderson and Krieger. I'm town council for Concord. Just by way of introduction, for those who I don't know as well, our firm and myself are also, in addition to being municipal lawyers, are other major practice areas in environmental law. So this site has been on our minds. It's something we've been involved with in some capacity, where in my case, over a decade, and firm's case, several decades. A couple of notes first. I want to sort of set the stage for kind of where I see our office and town council fitting in here and how we might how we'll interact with the task force. And then I want to get into some of the key legal issues, which actually aren't that different. Really, it's a recitation of a lot of the things Paul just put on the screen. In our general role as town council, we advise the town on really any legal issue that comes up, with a few limited exceptions. We take our direction under the town charter through the town manager's office. So that's Carrie LaFleur as a town manager, Megan Azemuto's in the back as a deputy town manager, and Chris do a lot of the day-to-day interaction with us and kind of driving legal questions in our way. I will, as we'll talk through, suggest that some of that will be the same in this case. And I think having staff input is important, and staff involvement as kind of both intermediary and long-term repository especially is important. In our role as town council, one of the things when I train our younger associates who are doing municipal work, one of the things that I often say is 90% of this job is figuring out separation of powers internally. It's who does what within the town. And so as I was listening to some of this conversation, and I was trying not to extend the recipe metaphor too far, thinking it's a smoothie or is this a blended, part that goes into another recipe. I think one of the things we'll keep an eye out on, in addition to thinking about what are some legal risks, what are the ways around legal risks for the town, ways to set up the town to have the maximum flexibility with the site. We'll also be thinking, as we have these discussions and as we hit issues on the legal more extreme, who else needs to be brought into this conversation? So just by way of example, the property acquisition and how that works obviously would involve the select board and town meeting. That's sort of an obvious one. Reuse plans, as I think everyone has thought about over the years, are going to need to involve planning staff. They're going to need to involve the planning board to some degree, to the extent that thinking about what the site might be in the future, or the risks involved with the site involve recreational uses versus potential public safety or public works uses. That obviously brings in those bodies too. So we're not, working with Megan and Chris. Part of my role will be thinking about, is this a place where, we as council need some direction beyond this task force, and we probably come back to you and say, here's who we recommend you talk to about that. So that's one piece of it. In terms of our general interaction with the task force, I'll cover again at the end sort of how we suggest kind of having questions come to us and work stream. It's great. You're already further along the road than I think most groups who have just formed like this, and to have kind of split up folks volunteering for different tasks. So I think we're in a really good place. And so that's sort of by way of just introduction. In terms of our past work on the site, I mentioned we have been involved with this for years now, kind of on and off. The site, as far as this conversation goes, I think is in a really good place to have this conversation. In our past iterations with the site, we have been involved with, I think of this as a StarMed site, because the first thing I did was try to figure out how the heck do you take title from people who don't really, an entity that no longer exists. That was my first interaction with this site, trying to figure out tax title for a defunct entity 10, 15 years ago. A couple of years later, we kind of came back to, all right, where is the site in terms of its remedy and what potential liability would the town have and how might we I'm just gonna leave the door slightly open so no one mistakes us for an executive session.
Yes.
Okay, just
Open meeting.
yeah, sort of open meeting, but
Okay.
but if that's okay, yeah, so I know there's some noise outside. So
Just notice.
yeah, no, that's fine. I know at 8:30 in the morning, I don't want to, I assume there's gonna be too many people in the hallway anyway. This is the open meeting law, brain.
Open door, open meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I just saw the three of us react. And you know, and we've been tracking the site throughout and kind of thinking about where it's at. This site's also very close to the Grace site, and we have our firm has been involved with the Grace site on the Acton side of the line since the mid-1980s. Actually, it was our first piece of municipal work was for Acton on the Grace site, all the way throughout now, including the bus depot and other issues. So we kind of understand that area well and have been thinking about this. And to my mind, this is a bit of repetition with what Paul mentioned as a key legal issues. Thanks, Chris.
How open the meeting?
Yeah,
is
how,
now.
yeah.
Quietly involved.
I apologize. I know I just didn't want to have the door totally closed. Yeah. There's a couple of key legal issues and put them in buckets for that I think we need to think about if the town were to acquire the site, if ultimately that decision was made. One is how can the town acquire clear title as possible for the site. And there are two reasons for that. One is
I just want to clarify, you said a couple of issues if the town were to decide, but actually these are issues that figure if the town is going to decide. They're not post-decision. issues.
correct, yes, yes,
Decision.
yeah, considerations for that.
I just mentioned that because in various conversations I've had, they kind of get jumbled.
Yes, yes. No, when I say if the town were to, these are things to think about in order to decide whether it makes sense for the town to acquire the site.
Right.
And if you were to do it, how to do it.
Right.
So yes, thank you, Paul. The first is getting clear title to the site. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is not a site where we can approach the current owner and say, hey, you want to do a sale? But there's not a current owner. There is a current steward, as it were, in the federal government. There are the two private parties that settled with the EPA, but there isn't quite an easy ownership group. Title matters for a couple of reasons. One is if the reuse ever includes any resale of all or a portion of the site, you're going to need to, a private party is going to need to know that you have title to pass on. And even if the town holds it, over the years, there've been a number of encumbrances and liens put on the property that we need to be able to address. There are the federal liens. The good news there is in our last couple of rounds of conversations with EPA going back last year, the year before, EPA has shown some willingness to work with us on figuring out how to resolve the federal liens it can resolve. Some of them are the Department of Defense's and how that works. We need to make sure if you take a quick look at the record, there is a suggestion there's a lot of mortgages and private liens. It's not clear what the current status of those are. If the town were to acquire the site outright, whether it's by eminent domain or some other method, it would have to pay those liens. We have to resolve those things, whether the EPA pays them, whether the government pays it in some other way, or the town pays it. And then, of course, you have to think about what encumbrances need to remain on the site. If those of you who tracked this during town meeting might recall, when acquiring the Grace site, there was some negotiation of easements left so that the PRPs could continue access the site You probably don't need exactly the same here, but you might need some continuing access rights for EPA, for DEP, et cetera. Again, this is where these groups interlock a little bit. The second and probably biggest issue, and I think the one on most people's mind, is how to resolve environmental liability for the town, or how to address potential liability. And when I speak about liability and environmental liability, what I mean is the long-term liability that comes with owning a contaminated or formerly contaminated site. And I know some of you already know this, but under CERCLA, just holding property typically makes an owner liable for whatever's underneath, regardless of whether you contributed any contamination to it. There are exceptions to that, and a lot of the exceptions have to do with how a property owner acquires a site, especially when it's at this phase of the contamination is known, it is being or has been addressed in a lot of the issues here. And the eligibility for those exceptions is something that you have to carefully manage at the outset. There's a lot of ways to get it wrong by not checking the right boxes, by not having the right agreements. Again, the good news is here you have a party, EPA, who controls a lot of the liability, and not entirely, as I'll mention in a second, but also wants the town to have an acquisition. It's clear that that's their ideal result would be the town acquiring the site. In order to think about whether that makes sense for the town, we have in the past advised the select board on a variety of different methods that the town could use to acquire the site. I think one of the goals of our work going forward will be which of these make sense to try to implement, and they're not always mutually exclusive. For instance, does it make sense to get covenants not to sue from EPA or to the extent DEP is involved, DEP, that typically resolves any governmental liability. It may not resolve third-party liability. The method of acquisition, as I mentioned, up until 2018, governmental entities had some ability to acquire sites without taking on liability, but there were some questions of whether it had to be quote unquote involuntary as in a tax title. They kind of end up with the property because of taxes. The 2018 amendments to Superfund in the Build Act did provide additional liability relief. And so that's something we want. That's fairly new. There's been a few examples of EPA and municipalities around the country using that. We want to explore those good models for that. The towns, again, within this region of EPA here in New England and elsewhere, have figured out ways to essentially enter into settlement agreements that allow for, and I know Pam, this is something you know firsthand too, to make sure that when a municipality acquires a property, having had no contribution to past contamination, it is relieved of liability or any potential liability. The big exception to that typically, and I just want to be clear about this, and this is why this is an issue that requires consideration both from an acquisition standpoint, but then longer term operation standpoint, is virtually all of the different schemes for protecting either a bona fide prospective purchaser, as it's called, or municipality taking property under federal and state law, require that the party that takes the property or owns the property maintain the, I don't want to use the term institutional controls because I know that's kind of has a technical meaning, but maintains whatever protections, including institutional controls, are in place to avoid actual risks to humans and the people in the environment, right? So even if you acquire with all of the protections in the world legally, you can undo some of the protections you've given yourself if you end up doing something that harms the existing remedy. The obvious example, just to use it, when we've talked about the school projects a lot in Concord, we've talked about the landfill, and there's always been this concern about piercing the cap. You want to make sure the cap is intact. That's an obvious no matter what liability relief the town might have had it not owned the site initially. There's no question that if the cap was pierced, if contamination was accessed in a sense, and that it might restore some liability. So you want to be very careful about understanding what that liability could look like or where it could come from, and ways to make sure that future generations understand how to avoid it.
Is it better, in my mind, I kind of separate the two issues. How can the town acquire the site with no legacy liability? And then how do we stay out of, how do we not incur future liability by operating, managing institutional controls after acquisition?
Correct.
We have to know what those institutional controls are
Correct.
beforehand.
Yeah.
But they're kind of-
They are two separate issues.
Yeah.
I think the reason I mentioned at the outset is, and this may be a fear that I've had from talking to a variety of clients, municipal and private, over the years, is, when folks see, for the public who might read notes later or minutes later, folks think words like covenant not to sue or, take without liability. You just need to be very clear that that is as long as you do not change the status of the site. But that's right. It's-
Or add to the contamination
add
for your own
to
access.
exacerbate it or do something
Right.
else, right? So there's that's the baseline. That's about as good as you can get as the. You are never going to be absolved from having responsibility to be good stewards. You can be absolved from responsibility for past contamination that you might otherwise have if you were just a regular old buyer buying the site, and not protecting yourself with any indemnifications or liability. From my perspective, yes,
Just to be clear, that means that in assessing liability risk, one has to understand the risk of disturbance, addition in the future.
Right.
Else your liability risk assessment now will be incomplete. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yeah, I think they're sort of two separate issues, but in the sense that of how you manage them. The liability risk that you might take on just by being an owner, you can often manage legally upfront. You can manage with legal agreements or legal method of acquisition. The risks that you can get into, the problems you can get into later in the operational phase, some of those risks can be managed legally, but predominantly it's understanding so that operationally you can manage, for instance, where you put buildings, how you do construction on the site, what health and safety plans are required if there is any excavation on site. I think that the key is, coming back to the timing and when to go to one body or another, is being very clear with your, within this group, but also within other town bodies of what we know now. And I always hate quoting Donald Rumsfeld. I'm sorry, I was getting his letters backwards. Donald Rumsfeld, the known unknowns, right? That's sort of what don't we know about the site, and what are we, unsure we're going to take. The goal from my perspective, just to tie this, is as you're thinking about this, is to see, is there a method for the town to acquire the site with no liability for past contamination, clearly defined understanding of how to limit liability during an operational phase, and maximum, this kind of gets into the last bucket, maximum ability to reuse, consistent with the remedy that's in place. And within that reuse, including whether the town, sort of understanding the town's ability to reuse as its own entity, or to potentially dispose of the property, later sell it, lease it in a long-term lease, et cetera, if it chooses to do so. Those are, you kind of want to be thinking about both at the same time. And again, one, I think you resolve more legally, and one that has a little bit more operation. Yeah.
Being naive to the legal issues, I presume that we talked about known unknowns. There are ostensibly known knowns.
Mhm.
So for example, there are X parts per million of X over here. that's the minimus, the maximus. Responsibility for determining. So in our, when the forms get signed, they take on the legal liability for saying that's known. So we assume the risk is described, right? The physical presence of stuff is described.
Yeah.
And they take on the legal responsibility for saying that's so.
When you say they, you mean the consultants for
Correct.
the existing, yeah. So, in a sense, yes. So one of the ways of acquisition is often described as, and it may be not exactly what the town does here, but it's a useful paradigm, is the bona fide prospective purchaser. And the idea there is it's somebody who's coming into the site, relying in good faith on the work done by other parties to investigate and remediate a site, but also doing their own due diligence. And so that in order for the town to be able to understand and to be able to take advantage of those liability protections, you typically have to do at least some baseline level of addressing, doing your kind of review of the work that others have done. And the kind of industry standard as a starting point is an ASTM phase 1. It's kind of a funny thing to do at this site in a way, because this is a site that has gone way beyond what a phase 1 would normally do. But doing that basic level is one of the checkboxes. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Not just taking their word for it.
Yeah, and not to quote every Republican over the last 40 years, but trust but verify as well, here. So, it's another piece to it.
So there is a step beyond their saying that it is so that we would need to fulfill
correct
on that aspect of things, the current risk issues at the site.
Correct, but I would not want to overstate what that step looks like, because there's been so much work done at this site. When you're talking about a phase 1, for instance, that's really a record review and really a paper review. There's no obligation for the town to go and dig its own test wells or to do its own sampling before it takes possession in order to be relieved of that liability, especially at a site that's so well and so heavily investigated. It might be a little different if you were going into a blind into a property that has suspected contamination, but you don't know how much.
On that point, we have a couple of other layers of insurance, if you will. You have sort of EPA's declarations and reports on exactly what's going on. We have the town consultant, Rue, whose job is looking at safety to assure themselves and the town that what EPA says they're doing, what DMAX says they're doing, is actually being done, to understand the methodology. And then we have Pam's committee, the 2229 oversight committee, who is really in the technical oversight. So there are resources behind that due diligence that has to be accomplished.
Yeah, but it's just to try to both, I think there's historic liability that I think we have to sort of conclude, we can probably easily dispose of. If we paper it correctly.
Correct.
If I'm using the word papering it, and that's when again, brought about the prospective person, et cetera. And I guess I would be comforted by the fact that ALA has been done, you're going to assemble it. We're going to get the right consultants and experts who have the reputations that would survive, let's say, a challenge in court.
Right.
And then beyond that, I think very comforting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the legal definition of due diligence has been so well developed
Correct.
that we are not in we're sort of in a pretty concrete world all around here with respect to that historic life. Do you agree with that?
I do, Jen. Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are, I'll mention sort of 2 areas that you can never fully discount, but you can't be paralyzed entirely by the risk either. One is emerging contaminants that were not known to be a problem at the time the work was happening. That's always an issue. It was an issue at the waste site with dioxin. Dioxin was sort of an emerging contaminant, had come up yet. PFAS is the one, and PFOAs are the ones that keep getting talked about. The good news, even on this site, is you have a pretty solid understanding, not just of what's in the ground and where it came from. It's the where it came from that really matters. You know a lot about the sort of uses of the site, and a lot of what you would do to address any new contaminant would be addressed by the same, by what's already been done, right? All the excavation, you've gotten a lot of this, that were not you, but EPA and the parties have gotten a lot of soil out of there. They've gotten a lot of groundwater out of it. So there is sort of a limited risk there, but it's always something that can be there. The other one that I mentioned, and it is one where I think the town can very easily get itself involved in a good way at the outset, if you're going down this road, is often towards the end of a remedies when natural resources damages are assessed. And that's, and I know there's a bunch of people in the room who are experts in that area, but that's always this concern that at the very end, this is where EPA and the trustees, essentially, the federal trustees, figure out, all right, what does this cost, not just for cleaning up the soil and groundwater, but what has this meant for larger ecological damages nearby? I have to admit, I think the last time we looked about a year ago, there wasn't much discussion yet of the natural resource, or NRDs as we'll often refer to them.
It's being negotiated.
It's being negotiated now.
Exactly.
So that's one of the things that just to keep an eye out on for, but the fact that's happening now, that's good. You know, it's not 20 years down the road.
Yeah, that's that last part, that's not so much protection, but that's sort of restoration.
Exactly.
It's a resource potentially available
Right.
for restoration and other.
Yeah, and so that may actually be an opportunity for the town to be involved in a meaningful way that gets you restoration that's useful to you, or that is how that the town can appreciate and you know, as a value.
If I may just, and forgive me because I did this with you just factually, but it's still not yet. But groundwater is one thing that can sometimes find a current owner and it's secret. I mean, do we have a good understanding of the migration of groundwater? And is that something that I should just, forget?
I wouldn't say forget, but I think as you get into more into the documents, and you know, I'll defer a little bit to the technical experts in the room too. In our review of it a year ago, it's certainly well delineated, and I wouldn't necessarily say for better or for worse, but for, you know, there, because of this site's long history, the nearby sites also having a long history, there's a pretty good understanding of where the water is flowing there, you know, does that, but that's, and you have the right resources in the room. I think that's the key point, is that you have RU on board, you have the technical help to sort of make sure that there aren't questions about, you know, has this been properly figured out over the years? So
I think it's a really good question for DeMaximus or Bruce Thompson on site, but I will say, and I think Pam will back me up, there's been tremendous amount of work on groundwater. I mean, really, EPA's been identifying new issues and drilling new wells. It's very well investigated thus far. To the point on emerging contaminants, 1,4-dioxane was not known until a few years ago as being a contaminant. EPA chased that down, put another remedy, got additional funds to chase that down. So I think there's a history of responsible response to the unknowns.
yeah,
Just, the groundwater, that's one of those classic things that you need to really.
yeah, and you know, in our experience, I mean, we've helped or worked with both towns and private entities when they've taken on sites where the contamination is just, this used to be an industrial facility, and that's all we know about it. And in those instances, I'd have much more of that kind of concern up front of, we just don't know exactly where it's going and what's in it. I think this is a site that is much further along in its life cycle in terms of investigating the remediation. It's a fairly well studied site. There's thousands and thousands of pages of testing.
Hey,
I want to talk about money real quick. You said that there was one of the things that would be required for us to do our due diligence engineering review. That's not just what volunteers have looked at through the years. That's a cost to the town to do that review.
Correct.
In addition to your fees, the legal review would be that, and that would be something where we would have an outside engineer do a records review, and they could get help from people who knew in the town what was going on. And the environmental restoration funds, that's also money we may or may not get a piece of at all.
Correct.
Correct.
So,
Yeah, and on the first one, I think, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's where having. There are grant opportunities for that, from EPA again, and there's no reason EPA couldn't be convinced to pay for more of it. Since the town has no, initial responsibility, those things can be negotiated. On the second piece, same thing, where the money comes from, would be the existing, responsible parties. And whether the town ends up being a holder of those funds or other entities, to use for restoration is something that it sounds like it's being.
Yeah, on the so-called engineering review, remember, the town has a consultant that they're hiring. In the short term to look at the safety issues, but I know I think the town is taking some comfort that there's an outside resource. And when RU is doing their work, they're actually doing the records review in progress right now. So they can do their report on safety to be sure that things are getting done and things are known. So I think this due diligence doesn't happen at the end, it's an ongoing.
we call this in the ASTM phase 1.
I'm using that as the kind of basic thing that you have to do at a minimum typically to get some of the liability. That is a very high level report relative to what has been happening at the site, and certainly to what RU is capable of. And it's
Very high level, very inexpensive.
yes.
And being paid for by a grant or by.
Well, we're not at that point yet, but possible.
But I'm not. I'm worried about the amount of work that has been done that is superficially comforting to us, but when you get right down to it and you're creating the record on liability, you're gonna have to spend, I think, I'm asking a question. My impression is you're gonna have to, what you want for due diligence is experts on particular angles that you have gotten assurances from their professional expertise point of view, that X, Y, or Z is true, and so that is gonna cost money.
Correct. And
You can't rely on pre-existing, 30,000 foot.
That's absolutely right. I will say, I think that we're talking, yes, consultants cost money. And lawyers unfortunately also cost money, but the consulting side, let's start there. In our experience, what costs the most money for environmental consultants is really the field work.
Right.
And that should be fairly limited in this case. And we're not talking about mobilizing RU. I don't think there's any immediate expectation, at least that I have, unless they see something and need to work with the Maximus to dig into it further, literally and figuratively. We're talking about desktop exercise, kind of use of professional judgment based on data that already exists. Gathering data is often the most expensive part of
I
consulting.
think it's gonna be useful in your work stream to kind of quantify that for the select board. What's required, what's the due diligence, what,
Oh,
yeah, and
Yeah.
because that's been a concern of the select board. What's it gonna cost us to, beyond the legal, what's gonna cost us just to make the decision on acquisition?
And that's what as I said, I think there's a lot of, it may not be granular enough or with enough technical expertise tacked on
Right.
to create the legal record we need to survive any kind of challenge.
Right.
That's all I'm saying. And I think probably there's a lot, I mean, this has been excellent because there's a lot, what you're saying is there's a lot of the hard, the financially difficult stuff that's happened as you do the field work.
Right, and I will say one other advantage in a way of this being a Superfund site versus a state hazardous waste chapter 21 site. Massachusetts has kind of privately administered hazardous waste program, as you all probably know. And while that has a lot of advantages, it means there's less assurance that DEP, for instance, has looked at every document and done that work. This has not only been a Superfund site, which does have a whole lot closer touch from EPA. It's been there are two private parties involved, but it's been one where there's two private parties plus the Department of Defense and EPA very heavily involved, partly because of the lack of owner. So you do have a lot more, to the extent that EPA it has a negotiated waivers of liability, releases from liability to the town. They're really doing it on the back of their own work as well, as opposed to just a private party who you know have to, you still have to verify, but it is a much less daunting task, I think. You know, but for the size of the site and the size of the problem initially, I think it's a much less daunting challenge than when you have, you know, a consultant who may or may not have done everything up to snuff. You know?
Well,
Yeah, it's going to sort of acknowledge, and I think part of this conversation, it relates to that, is there's what due diligence we might do to meet the legal standards to relieve the liability. But then there may also be the due diligence that the town wants to do as a responsible actor on behalf of the community, both from a risk communication point, but just as, you know, an entity that will ultimately be responsible for reuse. You know, almost a moral due diligence, you might say, and that might be beyond, you know, what the legal requirements are.
Absolutely. And just to give you an example from somewhat personal experience, both our firm and because it's near where I live, Russell Field in Cambridge is on top of a former Grace site as well, Grace sites. And they, you know, what the city required in terms of testing before it took over the site was it's been described to me as sort of the most intense, you know, grid of soil testing anyone's ever seen. It was well above and beyond what was required. In that case, they were not nearly as far along in the remedy. So I'm not suggesting you have to do anything like that. But yes, you know, communities especially, and depending on, again, this is where things start tied together. If your plan is to acquire the site and leave it open, how much you decide you need for hazard communication or risk communication to the public is going to be different than if some of the ideas being generated for reuse do involve more contact.
but you bring up an important point. We have to be very careful how we proceed with that. And I think whether we would recommend to the town that they do this another layer of intense due diligence, which is very costly. I think we have to look at what's been done at the site and assure ourselves, because there has been such intensive work done, is that sufficient? Because this site is an atypical site in terms of the intensity of sampling. So I think we have to look at that. And if there are gaps, then I think it's incumbent upon us to make that recommendation and the costs associated to that. I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's an important point.
To second your point, safe is a loose word. Safe, there's no such thing as safety to some people in some circumstances. It's not a scientific concept. So we have to respect that somehow in all of what we do. To see prudent about respecting that. Safe is a feeling for a lot of people. And it might be in this case, might not be, but we have to show respect for that.
Also, I just would add, and this is just based on my reading of the New York Times, but and having been involved a little bit in the canal, I mean, Love Canal was still a problem, and it was the most notorious site. It was the national emergency, and just 2 days ago, I didn't hear about public there and sales and houses here. I think there's a lot subjectivity. And there's a lot of uncertainty in not mean we should do that, but
To your point, you're right. It's subjective. Risk is even a stranger terminology. But I think it's our job to kind of inform the select board of the public, is the site safe? Because it's a concept people understand, how we define that. And you're right, you have to turn kind of the risk information into safety information. So just keep that in mind, is because that's a term that people understand. Risk is a term that there's never zero risk to anything, even cancer risk, 1 in a million is somebody.
Zero is absolute safety.
Yeah,
People
there's no absolute safety.
I think we may have a discussion about this because I would never say.
Excuse me?
Say as a sentence, very rare I ever say something. I mean, I just tell them, it's some things
Well,
are just,
we're gonna
they
have,
are relatively safe.
We have to demonstrate prudence around this. That's all I'm suggesting.
my,
Respect.
if I was talking to my family and my kids, my grandkids, and they said, Grandpa, is it safe to go on the site? I said, based on what I know, it's safe. I mean,
So
they said, yeah, what I know. So, right,
that's exactly right.
yes. Just want to remind, the task force members that are on hybrid, if you have any questions, use your raise hand. I didn't see anybody, just,
This is Kurt. I don't know how to raise my hand on this, but I have two questions.
okay.
One is related to the liens. I understand the mortgage liens and the tax lien. Can you speak at a high level what the DOG lien is? Because that's the single largest one, the $23 million lien.
Yeah, this is when the federal government has done this much work on a site, they will often have a lien to protect all the investment they've put into the cleanup. So the DOD and the federal government and in general have liens on the property with respect to that. And also in this case, the DOD had invested a lot of money even before we got to clean up and building out the site when it was a production facility, when it was a research facility. So those liens kind of protect all the money invested from there. The conversation that we've had, in the past with EPA is that they will consider what to do with that. There are issues. There are some things that are harder to remove than others. There's what's called the windfall lien, which is intended to protect the federal government from, having invested a ton of money in a property. Somebody takes it over, and immediately, now that it's clean, they sell it. They get it for a song because, like the town, they say, oh, well, we'll take care of it long term. Then they sell it for, huge amounts of money because now it's a clean site of undeveloped or barely developed land. The windfall lien is intended to protect the government from sort of missing out on that, and in fairness, because they've invested the money. And so it's a good policy certainly from the federal standpoint to protect taxpayers and so on. So the idea there, so that lien may not be one that you can entirely take away. I think, Kurt, the summary for today on the liens is that the first legal task, really, or one of the first legal tasks, is understanding the full scope of the liens that are on the property, and figuring out, what the town's proposed ask is EPA to do about it. That takes a little bit of understanding what they are and how they do it. The good news, being a governmental entity, is if you take land by eminent domain, you, as a legal matter, you take over all other legal rights. The bad news with that is that you also owe, what's the money for them. So for the mortgages, easements, and things like that, those are typically cleaned up during that process in the sense of getting released during that process. The tougher ones are these federal liens that kind of protect federal research investment plus cleanup investment.
Well, we had some early communication through EPA on that. I think there's some flexibility.
There's flexibility, yeah. I don't want to overpromise, but I think there is
There's
flexibility.
flexibility.
And they understand that, right? They're if they want to pass on the site, they need to be able to figure out how to deal with that. Again, in some ways, it's nice that you're dealing directly with EPA as essentially the site steward and holder, as opposed to just a regular.
Kurt, did you have a second question in there? I forget.
I did, unrelated to the question of liens. It's for Rue Associates and their reuse-focused risk analysis. Do we have a written scope of work? I understand they're coming to the next meeting, but if there's a written scope of work we could take a look at in advance, I think that would be helpful.
I'm looking at Chris Carmody. We do. And we have a proposal from, so yeah.
Actually, just to bring it
Yes,
back,
yes, Kurt. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
You're back? Okay. Okay.
sorry. I just picking up on request for just because material, you mentioned advising the town. How many legal memoranda are there that we can look at that come from, that are from Anderson and Krieger, that are from legal counsel as opposed to digested into other documents?
Sure. What I can say is we have in the past produced two, but it's really one because it got updated into one that I would say is sort of the comprehensive one. I would want to go back to see, what the level of what we said in it and, what I think, how much of it can be shared, without waiving privilege.
So then, I guess I'd ask, request if there are materials you think.
Yeah.
are not protected, so you need to be. That would be useful for us, that are raw, that are not digested in other documents.
Yeah, and I will add to that that there's a piece of that when I say I want to think about privilege, I also want to think about preserving privilege to the extent this, because I think this task force, working as the advisors to the town on this would be within the privilege. So I just want to think about how to best do that.
And if you think it's, I can think of a million reasons why you want to disclose the thinking of, but if it's.
The reason, the thing is, to the extent that we have any direct communications with you, and we have to talk about that.
Yeah, so
Should
that was
they
maybe where I end up actually.
Should they be marked privileged and confidential?
So let me, if I could, I can sort of talk through that issue and actually.
Yeah, I just had one other legal issue we haven't talked about,
Sure.
but when I review the scope of the charge, there is this line. Cost to bring site up to compliance with applicable state and federal laws and regulations. So I do think that's a legal question that we're gonna need your help on. What are those state and federal laws and regulations that we need to comply with?
Yeah, and so that's actually a good, perfect segue. So I think, given what we've talked about today and what our thinking was coming in, I see our possible tasks, and these are not all, immediate done at the same time or, paid for at the same time as four. There's sort of the title research and advice on what to do on lien issues and acquiring clean title. That's kind of one piece that also often, and this is a conversation we have with town staff as well as when and if to use outside title examiners to do a little more, because we do have a lot of the title work done by EPA, which is nice. It's a great starting point. In terms of, this actually kind of ties to the second question, or really the third is, we're going to need to think about recommending how to limit liability as the owner, both through those legal and operational means. From my perspective, when you're talking about that part of your charge, in this particular case, for this particular site, it is a combination of having Rue or another consultant's review of what's been done and where the site is and what is the likelihood that any third party or court could say that the remedy is completed is insufficient or it sort of needs more work. Assuming that the government entities and the two private entities reach completion on their remedy in the way that it's kind of been going, you would think that would mean there's compliance with what laws need to be complied with. So I think you're good there. And
Well, I guess my question is that not just environmental? So for example, if we're gonna do, the site's gonna be developed,
right,
are there other environmental and public health? or,
sure.
Other rules and regulations
Yes.
related to reuse that we have to be thinking
So,
about?
just for getting to the point of liability, so when you're talking about reuse, and this is sort of our fourth task is what are the implications for reuse? Most of those for a site like this most of those that are unique to the site will come from the environmental status. Everything else, I think, would probably fit really within our normal bailiwick as town council that we advise on a regular basis. So for instance, if the town decides, and this is completely hypothetical, I'm just throwing this out, but the town decides the best use of this property is, some kind of commercial use or more solar development. We would think about what the zoning looks like. But that's really no different than any other town acquired site. And then beyond that, there's very little that is different about this from a legal requirement standpoint, other than this is when you get into making sure that reuses are consistent with institutional controls. And any other safeguards on the site. So if the town has committed to putting a bylaw in place, for instance, that avoids access to particular soils, or making sure that's well integrated with the earth removal bylaw, so that there's nothing falls through the cracks. So I think it would be those smaller things which really would come up within sort of other tasks we do for the town.
There's one important one related to overall development, and that's stormwater control, and stormwater runoff. I'm not exactly sure what's in place right now on the site that the Maximus has put in place, but there's been some thought put into that, and I think our report discussed a little bit of that, but clearly there'll be some regulations related to stormwater control on the site overall. And maybe in control right now, I just don't know.
And right, so it's, that, and again, on the legal side, that's a fairly light lift on the legal side. That's mostly a technical one too. I'm
Right.
sure that it's not correct.
So I sort of divided the incredibly helpful presentation into kind of the historic library, which is to me concrete in a way that prospective liability based on what might happen. This gets into the institutional control and things. So I guess you basically just covered that. You will be providing us one of your deliverables, shall we say, will be also speculating, which it must be, on the legal risks associated with various kinds of controls that protect reuses and cap security and all that, and institutional control issues from fences to wings. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think what is, let me just sort of get a little bit to the nuts and bolts of how I would anticipate working, on this stuff going forward. As there's some things that we know today we probably need to do. There's a title research. Again, whether that happens first or not, it's sort of a bucket on its own. There is the giving advice on here are the different options for how you might acquire the site. And here's a proposed package that we suggest you take to EPA for how you acquire the site. That's sort of a work product that I anticipate, delivering to the town in a particular way. The sort of post acquisition liability piece, Pam, I think where I want to leave open a little bit to make sure we're doing this in the most efficient way for the town and the most useful to you and to the select board is whether it makes sense to, at the outset, try to characterize all of the potentials and the risks, or to sort of understand what's on the table and sort of be kind of remain in the picture and provide advice as ideas get put out there. Here's what we think of proposals that are out there, which may end up being more efficient, may not. So we just have to think about that. Yeah. And so the way I think we plan to work through this is after today's meeting and kind of hearing a little bit more about where everything stands, we want to put together kind of at least a rough budget for Megan and Chris and Carrie's understanding of what it might take us to, for instance, update our prior work, which has a lot of the prior analysis on. Here are some options that are there, but I want to make sure. One thing I've learned over the past couple of years is almost every one of these infrastructure bills and COVID bills has little, kind of hidden nuggets for relief for different things. Is there anything new since the 2018 rules that can be even better? Might update for that. So there's sort of an update pieces. There's a budget probably for the title research. I want to do that part next. But a lot of this work is going to be iterative as you all think of questions, as one task force thinks of sort of issues that come up. It will naturally tie into legal issues that that work stream is thinking of, and I think that's Pam and Court, right? We're sort of that you might hear about. I think ideally we'd function like we do with any other town committee and board, which is this is kind of getting to your question, Paul, which is that questions or sort of thoughts of something that might need council input go to staff liaison for those committees, so in this case, Megan and Chris, who then have a pretty good read just from dealing with us every day, whether something is a factual question. Sometimes it seems like a legal question, but it's actually a factual question the clerk's office knows, or somebody, at planning knows better. Versus something we need to look into. And if they're not sure, they'll ask and we'll say, this is not really a legal question, it's more this, and we'll kind of figure it out from there. But I would sort of communicate that through staff. That's not to say we won't have direct.
Town staff.
Yeah, town staff, excuse me. Direct, I actually would anticipate that the process would be for us to work with the legal work stream, through the legal work stream, kind of as a group, to make sure we're providing work product that's useful to this group and ultimately useful to select board. In terms of privilege, obviously what I say in an open meeting is not itself going to be privileged. This is that. However, within your capacities as town, appointed committee members or task force, when we do have a conversation that's not in with a quorum or either an executive session or with a smaller one or two members of it, that would be privileged kind of presumptively. I would say that it is also the case that some internal passing back and forth advice from us, even if we're not involved, could be privileged. It gets a little trickier. Or asking for legal advice that way could be privileged. It certainly doesn't hurt if you're involving us all to mark something privileged and confidential. It's not absolutely, I would just be clear that that's not going to make something privileged or undo something from being privileged by doing it. Where it does help,
It's all discoverable.
it's all discoverable, but what it helps with, I will say, sometimes is marking it, if there is a public records request, it makes everybody's job slightly easier to know this was there. That being said, I know, from working enough with these guys, that anything with our name on it is going to be.
So let me clarify a few things. First, I think you should try to develop a work plan and, with Mina's input. So from what you say. Let me continue that.
Staff or not.
Let me get you. So you need to develop a plan, and then that's a little bit iterative. How that communication occurs, a little ambiguous, and
Sure.
So first of all, who's our official liaison for the committee? Both, okay. So, okay. So that communication, I'd like to be copied on stuff, but it should go to those guys and they'll send it on to, whatever the questions are, whether it's a draft work plan or specific questions. So we have that path in court.
So, and to pick up on what you're saying, I'm imagining you and I would work on a more detailed work plan. It would go to town staff. Town staff would delineate what's fact side, what's opinion side. Paul's watching what's happening, and that would lead us to Mina to fine tune the legal side of our work plan.
I think generally
Something
speaking,
like that?
yeah, I think generally speaking, and I don't want to suggest that we're playing an endless game of telephone. I think, Chris and Megan, feel free to jump in if I'm misstating this, but for instance, when we've worked on a zoning issue with planning staff, and planning board members, the premise isn't that, we only talk to staff and staff only talks to board members. It's that there's sort of, everybody's kind of kept in the loop, and it just kind of, so that the town doesn't feel like they have no idea what council and the board are talking about. And at the same time, I don't feel like I don't know if this is a directed, this is just one board member's, off the wall idea, or if this is sort of a collective thought. So I think that's sort of the general thing. I would expect that as we get into this, the five of us end up working as a group pretty regularly.
And remember, this is a communication pathway, but everything we do is going to be if we're going to have another legal discussion of your work plan, it's going to be in the meeting package. So it's going to be all public information, but you may want to get Mina's advice before,
Yeah, I mean, the question is, which I disabusing myself. that it will be a process, and eventually the process may take us to a direct phone call between you, let's say.
Yeah, or bring a particular issue that you're
It will
working with.
be ever get to it, and that's, makes total good sense because it has to be controlled, but there may be an opportunity at some point to say, we need to talk, threesome or foursome or five.
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely.
And as far as the larger task, as I said before, there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not all gonna be done as a group, so you guys should feel free to move forward, and then when we have our meetings, brief us on that, so, but it's,
Can I ask a totally unrelated question? This is just really, super fun one. When do you think the site is gonna get released?
Good question. I have to.
I'm sorry, what's
When's the site going to get delisted? Do we know do we have from a Superfund standpoint?
when's the dealers?
Yeah.
No, no,
Yeah.
it's no longer-
Beyond Superfund.
Oh, boy,
I think we're done with.
that's a good question. Good question for Kara. But I see Terry's hand is raised. So look, Kara, can you answer that question? I think, I know what the answer is.
Sure. Can you repeat it one more time? I'm having a little trouble hearing Pam. Is it a question
The
about
question is-
delisting?
Pam's question is, when do you think the site would be delisted, closed, clean?
Not for a very long time. I mean, there'll be waste in place forever. And that does not mean the site can't be delisted, even if there's waste in place, as long as it's being managed. But you know, at a minimum of 30 years, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, so there are remediation systems. We didn't talk about operation maintenance that EPA will maintain. So there's institutional controls, but also they're going to be on the site managing the pump and treat, managing the process. So, yeah, so when she says 30 years, there's some contaminants that can take a long time to get removed, but that doesn't preclude use of the site. So let me, in our remaining minutes, I want to take other questions, then do a few little other things. So Terry Ackerman has a question.
Yes, I have a process question. Also, I agree with Kara. I'm having trouble hearing Pam for some reason. But
Yeah,
Mina,
because the speakers are here.
okay. Mina, you brought up that there are some things to think through about privilege. And I'm wondering if you want to come to the select board in an executive session to talk about your work plan, maybe with Pam and Court, and we could decide whether to vote that this whole committee would have privilege or just Pam and Court, or however it's going to work.
So Terry, certainly the first half of that is a good idea at some point. That's the kind of conversation when I say we want to make, this is partly where it's really helpful to continue to have Chris and Megan and I kind of thinking about who needs to talk when. With respect to privilege, the select board doesn't have to vote it for it to exist. It's really a matter of applying the very complicated set of legal standards of who's in and out of privilege. I would say, thinking about the tasks that I'm being asked to do, or that our office is being asked to do, and the role this committee is being asked to, this task force is being asked to play in Court and Pam in particular, our communications would be privileged because they are working within town government to help advise the town, help advise the town on legal issues or to pass legal issues. So I don't have a concern about that. Where privilege issues get trickier, the reason I'm saying they get trickier is not so much who's involved, it's where and when and how they're involved. So obviously in an open meeting, what we say today isn't going to be privileged. If something gets released in a report or doesn't, how much of a privilege is weight. I wouldn't at the outset, while privilege is important, I always am wary of having folks more worried about privilege than they are about ultimately getting the right answer. And especially to work with public entities, this is a public process. There's going to be some stuff communicating what the risks are and what the town's doing about them is gonna have to happen at some degree.
Nina, could you give us an example of some issue that might have an executive session, something that is really confidential,
Yeah.
that would have this task force in executive session?
Sure, and no offense to Kara at all, but if we're negotiating a particular liability relief package that we want from EPA, and we're saying, here are some of the legal issues EPA might raise, or some of the other, the other PRPs might have an issue with or not, we may want to talk about that, and that would fit under the executive session purpose of discussing strategy with respect to acquisition of property, for instance.
Okay.
And so that might be a basis for executive session, so that folks can speak freely about, goals and risks the town is willing to take or not willing to take.
Okay,
And
thank you.
Those are the type of issues that are so clearly privileged and confidential, right?
Correct.
As opposed to some of the other things. Just because you're an attorney doesn't mean everything we talk to you about is privileged.
Generally speaking, that's right. I will say, we're giving advice. We're giving advice about risk. We're giving advice about different issues, about different strategy options. And one of the reasons for privilege isn't just because I think this is always a misconception that the whole idea of privilege is to protect. I think we all think of sort of the criminal defense piece, so that people don't know bad things that happen. But it's also so people can speak candidly and ask questions without worrying about, did I ask a dumb question or not? It's being able to give candid advice and for folks to hear it, be able to ask candid questions. So there are times when, I will say in this particular circumstance where you have, a lot of people working together to figure out what's best for the town and what's best for the site, with EPA, we're not talking about adversarial privilege necessarily here. So, but it's definitely something to be aware of.
Yeah. I think so far, this committee hasn't drawn, to my knowledge, a lot of public attention. But at some point it will. And I think the more open, visible, present we are, your talk about the safety versus the risk and the reality of that kind of stuff. It's the same in my mind with the legal issues. That the more out front we are in our discussions and open, the better. And of course, I understand there are times where it's just simply more efficient to work through staff to your office. But if we're talking to an attorney in a meeting, again, at town council, I'd rather it be in public on camera.
Yeah, no offense, if Nina was a volunteer, there wouldn't be any problem, but because there's a budget involved for that, we have people who have to approve these, right? Unless you want to volunteer yourself.
Well, I will say, it's no offense taken. It's both the budget, and I actually just think from my perspective, it creates better work product to ultimately know, one of the fun parts of working with institutional clients is, you're not working with one person. It's not, when you're a divorce attorney, you have one client. When you're talking, when the town is your client, you kind of have to keep an eye on, is this the town's message? This group and this select board doesn't seem to be working in a way where anyone's suggesting that they're going to go off on their own and want to get their own agenda. But that's.
But I agree, the more we're open, we have to get the public on board. Hopefully just not at these formal meetings, but if we get public interest now, that's probably a pipe dream, but if we can get 10 or 20 people listening to these meetings over time, that would be great.
Yep.
I want to start wrapping this up. I'm inviting additional comments from anybody. Pam?
So you were talking about being a bona fide prospective purchaser, and we cut you off and went in another direction.
Sure.
Was there another type of purchaser or another thing on that list that you want?
We don't need to go into all of them now, but there's a variety of different ways that the town can acquire the site. And again, they're not mutually exclusive. But the bona fide prospective purchaser is one defense from liability. The acquisition by eminent domain is another. The acquisition through one option that I know has been talked about is restrictions versus full ownership of the site. There are, I think I've mentioned most of them through the conversation, but thanks for asking, like the covenant not to sue program. There is some state liability involved here. too, and the liability protections don't overlap 100% between state and federal. So for instance, some of the liability relief that's given to on the federal side for public entities like municipalities isn't quite as strong under Chapter 21E, but what there is the covenant not to sue program with the Attorney General's office, where they essentially can get you to almost the same, basically the same place as far as liability goes.
We can get a bunch of those things together.
Yeah, you know, and use a much smaller project as an example from years ago, but you know, the Coet Farm in Acton. We worked on that deal, and that was between the farm use, and it turned out there was a former tannery on the property in the 1800s. What we ended up doing for that property was a mix of a covenant not to sue, getting sort of a closed off remediation status, a brownfields grant to get environmental insurance that sort of added a layer of liability protection. And I believe, trying to remember if the town also uses eminent domain rights, but there's sort of, you know, you kind of use a package deal for layers of protection, and which ones make sense for that particular property.
So when it comes to reuse, do any of those come with less? If we were to run programs there, like a sports program,
Yeah.
and charge for the sports program, versus if we were to have somebody run a sports program there and they are a for-profit company.
Yeah.
Does that limit what profits?
It's a great question. Generally speaking, no, under the newer protections. One of the reasons I mentioned the state versus federal liability and what the pre-2018 realm is, there was this idea of involuntary, what the sort of original concept of why to protect towns was that they sometimes end up with property that they didn't ask for. State law often requires you to take property to fulfill taxes, for instance. And it would be unfair. This is getting a little bit so weeds, so I'll try to be very quick. But
This is by far, this is just the beginning
Yeah,
of a long
exactly, yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
There's
so-
The many issues. I want to take one more question and kind of complete the
Yeah.
agenda. Terry, another question.
Right, I have two quick related questions. So the first one was, Mina, you were talking about 4 buckets of tasks. And one was title research and one was how to limit liability, and I didn't get the other two.
Sure. The other two were methods. The second and third are kind of related, but I would sort of frame them out as the way Pam did a little while ago. Pam Hill did a little while ago. The methods for acquisition to limit liability and post closing liability issues. And then the fourth, and they're all related, obviously, but the fourth is legal concerns around reuse, or legal issues around reuse, which would involve, for instance, just to give you a bit, without going back into it too far, Paul, the big question I would have for you, Pam, is, or for, you know, that I would be thinking about is, depending on how we acquire, do we lose liability if we resell or enter into a long-term lease?
Okay.
And are we allowed to do that, for instance, if we use eminent domain, how do we justify it to the public?
They're just
Okay.
flashing this up once more. It is sort of in this this outline.
It's more or less-
We've touched on these, and we will continue to touch on these as we move forward. So I just put that up
Okay,
one more time.
so just very quickly, Nina, do you anticipate coming to the select board with a work plan in the next few months, or what kind of time frame are you, when do you think you're gonna need to come to the select board?
In terms of putting together a work plan, I think we can do that fairly quickly in the next couple of weeks to a month. I will defer to Megan, Carrie, and Chris to talk with, you know, with the select board members and Henry as the chair to figure out whether it makes sense for us to come to the board then, or to kind of work through the town manager's office and this group for now and then go back. So, yeah.
Okay.
Certainly, any ideas?
I don't mean to pull rank, but I think the task, you charge the task force to kind of handle these issues. So whatever Mina's work plan is, it should be something that Pam and Court. It's our work plan. So
Okay,
we do it collectively. So
Responsibilities within it.
yeah, you know, there's lots of moving parts here. And one of my jobs is to make sure that we follow all the moving parts. Outside consultants, select board, outside counsel. Herding big cats. I want to just conclude the meeting with, so our next meeting is going to be on the 27th. Rue is going, and I want to thank Mina very much for a great discussion and for working with us. How should I say it? We can't do this without you. And as
I
I mentioned,
appreciate it and likewise. yes.
well, and I mentioned this, the legal piece is a linchpin. Nothing else. I mean, the other work streams are important and they have to move together. But if the town can't, if the select board can't be convinced that to acquire this property with minimum liability, resolution of liens, good for the town, no matter what our intents are in reusing the property, it's not gonna happen. So this is a linchpin. So the next meeting, Rue is going to brief us. Carl and Carrie has put forward a work plan for their piece. I'd like to have enough time to discuss both issues. We'll see if we can get that. I'll circulate Carl's work plan at the next meeting. So that'll be sort of discussing the risk/safety issues along with the operational part. I'm not sure we can squeeze that into an hour and a half, but I'll put that in the agenda. But then the 28th, we have a meeting on site. I'd like you to think about the questions that, how do we want this site visit to operate? Usually, Bruce will do whatever we would like. We want a sort of a session of briefing of some of the issues and then walk around the site, or you just want to walk around the site. I know that the oversight committee, Rue, and our committee will all be there. That's be a big gathering, but if we want to have Bruce talk to us before we go on the site, then having a list of questions for him beforehand will help him. So if you have those questions for the site visit, please send them to me and I'll send them to Bruce so he can prepare this big group. That's the 28th at 1 p.m. Our next meeting is at 7:30 p.m. And I sent you the invites through July, but we need to discuss specifics on beyond June. Are there any, Court?
What does Rue think they're doing on the
Go
27th
ahead.
with us?
I'm sorry?
Does Rue have an expectation or an assignment for the 27th with us?
Yes, they're going to introduce themselves and brief us on their scope of work and maybe figure out who we are and how to interact, and I think we have to discuss ways, just like we're doing with me, just ways of working together. Because they work for the town. And so they're a resource to us. Remember that Venn diagram I put together, all these interlocking things?
You're gonna circulate that.
What's that?
You're gonna circulate the written scope before the meeting.
Yes, Chris has that scope. It's scope and their proposal as because the scope is a little bit in general and their proposal more specific. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess putting that on set up a meeting packet, put that in the packet would be the best way to do it. Any other business? So a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjournment.
Second? All in favor?
I
Hi.
You're in adjournment. Thank you very much, everybody.